Hello, my name is Joshua Tyler, and I am into digital signal processing. And I've seen a lot of things on the argument about sampling frequency for music, and that refers to digital music. And I'm here not to end the conversation, but maybe add my 2 cents to it from what I've observed from processing digital signals. So, first, when we talk about sampling audio, we have two things. We have the bit rate. Let's see here. We have the bit. Oh, sorry, this is a little frustrating. Rate, and then we have the sampling frequency. So the bit rate will be the smallest step that you can have in magnitude between two samples. So when we look at a signal, when we look at a large signal, we'll just see this. And this in digital is on a scale from 1 to negative 1. Excuse me there. So what uh, if we zoom up on it, what we'll actually see is little staircases. So the bit rate will determine the length, or the minimum length between these different steps. So when we talk about bit rates, we say how many bits per sample can we, how many bits will represent each sample. So each sample will have, let's say, for example, 24 bits. So this says on a scale, so on a scale of -1 to 1, and we say, so typically what we'll have when we have a bits per sample, we'll have -2 to the, we'll say bits is in, or bits divided by 2, to 2 times bits divided by 2 minus 1, because we have to represent 0 in there. So the total number will be the the amount of numbers that we have to represent a signal on 0 to -1 is 2 to the bits. So let me do a quick calculation. 2 to the power 24. So 2 to the 20. Typically, we sample at 24 bits, or we listen to music at 24 bits. So 2 to the 24 will equal this really large number: 1, 6, 7, 7, 7, 2, 1, 6. And then we go back and add our commas. About 16,700,077,216 different numbers can be represented. And then and those are the amount of numbers between -1 and 1 that we can have. And that will be our dynamic range, our dynamic volume range on the signal. So that's what the bit rate does. It just says how many different volumes, what's the dynamic volume we can have um, on a sample, or what's the resolution of magnitude that we can see on a signal. And our second thing is sampling frequency. So our sampling frequency asks how many samples can we take during in a second on a signal. So let's say we have an analog signal like this. This is a continuous signal. There's no discreteness to it. And then what a analog to digital converter will do is every n times per second it will take a signal. So let's say this is half a second, or let's just say this is 1 second for convenience sake. And let's say we're sampling at a rate of 10 samples per second. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4. What we do is cut this into 5. So let's just say this is 5, and that would be 7, or yeah, no, that would be, so let me undo that. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So let's say 6, 7, 8, 9. And then we'll have 1, 2, 3, 4. So 1, 4, 2, 3. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So I'll say every one. So at a sampling frequency of 10, I'm going to take a sample, and then my output will be whatever the signal is at that time. So here, I'm going to use a different color. I'm going to take a sample here, and take a sample here. I'm going to take a sample here, 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 and here. Then what I'm left with is this little digital signal here. And you can see with the lower data rate, you'd lose a lot of the information on that signal. So you lose the trough here. Let's see, you get the crest here. You don't see the crest there. So you lose a lot of the continuous information there. And let's talk about another concept, Nyquist. And this has been used to end a lot of the debates about what sampling frequency that you need for music. And Nyquist says that whatever signal that you want to sample, you need to sample at twice that frequency. So if I'm sampling at, well, if the highest signal that I want to capture, or the highest frequency I want to capture, let's say that's 2 kilohertz. Nyquist theorem says that I have to at 4. So this is 2. I have to sample at 4 times that rate, or 2 times that rate, in order to capture. We go back to our signal here. Well, let's just say this is an even signal. Let's say this is a clean 2 hertz signal. If I want to capture the midpoint and the crest and the trough, I have to sample at 2 times that frequency. So if the highest frequency I want to capture is 2 kilohertz, I have to sample at 4 kilohertz. And for human hearing, let's see, the highest frequency that you can hear is 22 kilohertz. I can't hear that, but I'm sure some people do. So then they say all that you have to sample at for music is just the 44 kilohertz, or for some reason they do 44.1 kilohertz. And they say something like 92 kilohertz is unneeded. So all they do is they pull out the Nyquist theorem and they say, well, due to Nyquist, you only have to sample at 44.1 kilohertz. End of discussion. But an issue arises when you have frequencies that rub up against that 22 kilohertz, or even about halfway. So even about 11 kilohertz to 22 kilohertz. If it's not that pure 22 kilohertz, or a multiple of 22 kilohertz below or between half of it, then you're going to introduce some type of magnitude modulation. And I'll pull up a MATLAB script here that I wrote to show that. So here in MATLAB, I've said, in order to protect hearing and for everybody to be able to hear it, I'm only sampling at 1000 kilohertz. But the same principle applies when you move it up to 44 kilohertz or 44.1 kilohertz. I'm going to say our initial sampling frequency will be 1000, and I'll have the multiple there. So then our actual output sampling frequency stays at 1000. And then I'll put out a signal at half that. So Nyquist says sampling frequency, the maximum frequency you can capture is half of that. I'm going to set the period as 1 over the sampling frequency. So that period will, so every 1/1000th of a second, you'll capture data. Time start is 0, T end 2 seconds. So then our time matrix here is 0, 1/1000th of a second to 2 seconds. And then I'll generate our signal based on the signal in the audio frequency. Because MATLAB uses radians, I'll multiply that by 2 pi, and then I'll just generate a cosine signal at that frequency, cosine 500t, or based on radians, you see there 3.1 kiloradians per second. And then I'm going to, just to be able to show that plot that frequency and show what's happening without you actually having to hear it, if the YouTube compression destroys my example. Auditorily, you'll be able to see it visually. And then we plot that, and then, all right, so here I'll play the signal, the script will play the signal, and then it will plot the signal on a certain range. Because if I just show you the whole thing from start to finish, then it won't really show what I'm trying to show. So I'll show just a part of it, or maybe half. Okay, so here it goes. So I'm sampling at 1000, frequency is 500. Okay, so if we see on the graph, that looks fine. It's actually a triangle wave. If I just do 10, you see that's actually a triangle wave. So that's fine and dandy. That's okay for the Nyquist theorem frequency. But what happens? Let me change this to 499 hertz. Let's see what happens there. See, we get that magnitude modulation. Let me try that again. let me show you what happens there. So at 499 hertz, sampling at 1000 hertz, we get this magnitude modulation, which is not really talked about in Nyquist. You actually have to, there's mathematics for it that you can pull out with there's some discrete mathematics, but you'd have to do Fourier transform, and that would take a whole lot of time to explain, and that would be very dry. So, in order to save everybody's attention, I'm just doing the real world example. So, let's try 498 hertz. See, you have even more of that modulation. See, and that's why um, just 2 times the maximum hearing is not enough. You get this modulation. Now let me multiply this. Let me double the sampling frequency and keep it at 497 hertz. See, you get a whole lot less modulation. Let me turn this down a little bit. So let me show you again. This is at 1 time the sampling frequency. This is frequency of 497 sampled at 1 kilohertz. And then let me sample that at 2 kilohertz. And then let me sample that again at 4 times. See, by increasing that sampling frequency, you're reducing the magnitude modulation that happens to the frequencies that brush up against that Nyquist limit. So I don't know what the human hearing. I don't know why the human hearing is at 22 kilohertz, and I can't hear 22 kilohertz, and I don't know what it does for clarity. But if Darwin is right, then we have evolved to have that 22 kilohertz range, that or whatever it is, the 16 to 22 kilohertz range. That's 16 hertz, 22 kilohertz range. So it may be for a clarity thing, but what happens when we sample at 44.1 kilohertz? We lose a lot of that clarity from the 11 to the 22 kilohertz range, the 11 kilohertz to the 22 kilohertz range. So that might, it's like I've noticed that you don't really get much in the low end of the song, of the music, when you sample at 44.1 kilohertz. But when it comes to the clarity of the highs in the song, you get a lot. It's a lot crisper when you sample at the 96 kilohertz or even the 100 or 92 kilohertz range. Uh, so it's a lot better if you want the fuller range. Now for CDs, you just pop that into your stereo and you don't care. That's fine. But when it comes to audio purists, do have a point when it comes to higher sampled music, whether it's 96 kilohertz, 124 kilohertz, or even 192 kilohertz. So if we look at so the sampling at 4 times the Nyquist maximum for 5 kilohertz is 4. So if we take 192 kilohertz and divide that by 441, see we get about 4.3 that for a scale of 4.3 times the Nyquist maximum, which means that you're going to have less magnitude modulation of the higher frequencies. So that is why higher sampled frequency is important and relevant to audio purists. All right, thank you. This is more of a scientific. I like doing more of the physics behind it, or it's not maybe not physics, but more of the nitty gritty of why things need to be for good audio. So my name is Joshua Tyler. Yeah, I don't care if you subscribe or not. I'm doing this for fun. If you learn something, let me know. If it helps you win an argument, let me know. If not, let me know and ask me what you need to win an argument. And I'll see you again if I do.